Hey, everybody, thanks for finding During the Break podcast. Do me a favor. If you're listening on iTunes or Apple, leave us a rating or a review. It really helps. No matter what platform you're listening on, please subscribe because I'm releasing great conversations and every now and then a few solo podcasts on a consistent basis. My podcast, as always, brought to you by my good buddy Dan Miniger, who owns a company called Granite Garage Floors right here in Southeast Tennessee, North Georgia area, 423-592-3131. If you have a garage, porch, basement, showroom, concrete floor, and you want it to look great, have a lifetime warranty, be easy to clean, durable, all that good stuff, you need to call my buddy Dan Miniger, Granite Garage Floors of Chattanooga, 423-592-3131. He's done work for my family and friends. Great product, very affordable, does fantastic work. With all that being said, really hope you enjoy this episode of During the Break podcast. Oh, check out my other podcast with my buddy Dawson Wheeler about adventures in the great outdoors, dayfirepodcast.com. It's of, by, and for the people, conversations centered around the American experiment. I'm Clint Powell. I host a bunch of other podcasts and do sales consulting. The other podcast I host is Dayfire Podcast with my buddy Dawson Wheeler about adventures in the great outdoors. I also have During the Break podcast you can find on all of your favorite podcast platforms. I've been told we're supposed to tell everybody who we are. So there we go. I've got 3 guests coming up. Now, this conversation may go in a couple different directions, but it all started from a couple of memes that I saw my friends post. And it continues a theme we have of how we dialogue with each other when we disagree. And it's basically, the meme is, I am a liberal or I'm more to the left because of compassion, and people who are more conservative have more of a selfish outlook on life. Now, the meme, for simplifies it, as memes do. They're so effective at getting across these really nuanced ideas. Nothing says nuanced idea like a good meme or bumper sticker. But that was my genesis. When I sent that to these 3 guys, I'm like, man, that frustrates me because if my neighbors think I'm selfish, then where do we go from there? Like we've talked about in the past, if everybody's a Nazi, if everybody's a Marxist, well, I don't have to be nice to Nazis and Marxists and people. So if my neighbor's that, it kind of alienates each other. Now, with my explanation and ramblings out of the way, let's bring up Eric Buchanan, and he can put his 2 cents. And what's up, Eric Buchanan?
Hey, Clint, how are you? Good to see you.
I'm good. Did I do a decent job of setting this thing up?
I think you did. The meme was, if I get this right, people on the right say it's all about me. People on the left say I'm compassionate. That's why I will always be on the left.
Yeah.
It's a simple meme. It's also smoking hot bullcrap. And that's what I hope we're going to explore today. And I don't want to go too deep into that before we get our other friends on here. So quick introduction. I'm Eric Buchanan. I'm an attorney in Chattanooga, Tennessee. I have a history major and a lawyer. I was also a Navy aviator. And I'm a big fan of U.S. history and the Constitution, and I consider myself somewhat of a constitutional scholar in American history, at least both by serious hobby level understanding.
Yeah. Ask Eric if he's a pilot. He loves that. Look at it. Not a pilot.
Well, that'll be a separate podcast. We'll explain that one.
What's up, Jason?
Hey, Clint, Eric, how are you guys?
Hey, Jason, how are you? Good to see you.
Great. Good to see you too.
All right, do us the thumbnail sketch of who you are real quick. I know you've said it before, but then we'll bring Matthew up and we'll jump into this thing, man.
Sure. I am a professor at a local university teaching in the College of Business. I primarily teach ethics and leadership and economics, political science major with a history minor. So like Eric, I have a passion for all things history and looking forward to this conversation.
It'll be a good one.
And when he says local school, he means local in Oklahoma.
There you go. That's right.
All right, let's bring up another well-educated person. Matthew Durham, what's up, buddy?
Gentlemen, it's a good day. How y'all doing?
Good.
To see you, Matthew.
Tell everybody who you are, what you do, and all that good stuff.
Sure. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Tennessee at Chattanooga. Did my undergraduate in philosophy and my master's degree in research psychology. And I have a background in doing cancer research as well for about 8 years. And currently I'm focusing on facilitating the reduction of political prejudice through intergroup contact.
We had Matthew on before to talk about that a little bit, and it goes to what you do, Eric, with the Braver Angels. How do people dialogue now when we disagree? You know, the difference between how do we not take pushback personal? And real quick, it happens every time I get on with you, just so you know. My car warranty may be running out, so I may have to take this call in just a minute. They may try to call me back.
Have you sold your house to the guy who texted you yet?
No, dude, I'm not. I'm renting anyway. He doesn't. I don't know why he's texting me. So the thing I wanted to add in here, and I know Eric, you're very knee deep into Braver Angels. Is this a good place for you to do your plug?
Sure. Braver Angels is an organization focused on patriotic empathy, reminding us that we are all Americans, whether we disagree if we're on the right or the left. We should be able to talk to each other and discuss ideas. And it was founded by two guys who were good friends but political opposites, who realized that America was becoming more and more polarized, and there was not a good place for Americans to have conversations. Check it out at braverangels.org. I'll just say one quick lesson that we've learned in the work that I've been doing is people on the right hear this extreme leftist stuff going on in the Democratic Party in America, and it turns out that's not most Democrats. And people on the left hear this extreme right-wing, I don't know what kind of stuff on the far right, is they hear what's going on with the Republicans, and that's not most Republicans or most conservatives. And so lesson number one we've learned by actually talking about this stuff is most people are reasonable, somewhat moderate, but we have differing views. We just can't talk about those different views right now because social media and all the other tsunami of information out there, and the, I think, intentional way that this stuff is being sold. You don't sell a lot of newspapers anymore, or more accurately, your cable TV network doesn't get a lot of viewers if you don't paint the most extreme picture. And that's part of what we're trying to work through, is how to understand what's really going on.
Yeah, I agree. Real quick, let's make sure we say hi. What's up, Denise? Thank you for jumping on with us. We appreciate that. It is raining where we're at, and we've had 14 days of rain so far in the month of July if you live in the Chattanooga, North Georgia area. So I'm ready for some sunshine too, Denise. One of the things that I thought of originally when I sent this, when I had all three of you smart people chiming in, I'm like, oh, crap, I've stirred up something. They really think I have a good idea, or maybe an idea, is I go back to conversations that we have had the last 3 or 4 months. And that is the use of defining terms, right? Because when you read a simple meme and I read, they think of them, or they think selfishly, and we think compassionate. What is your definition of selfish and compassionate, right? Does that make sense? Or am I starting it too far back or too far forward in the conversation? Jason, Matthew, either one of y'all? Eric's already talked.
I can make a quick reference to a philosopher by the name of Bertrand Russell, who talked about how there are ways that you can frame a term both positively and negatively. So, for example, protest, right? It's somewhat neutral, right? Maybe, but you can also reframe that in terms of riot, right? So that's the negative framing of the more neutral term. Or you can reframe it positively in terms of some kind of maybe gathering is the neutral term, and protest would be the positive term, right? So this is a case where I think in this particular memes case, where we have taken the neutral and for liberals, we've framed it in the positive sense, and for conservatives, we framed it in the negative. So yeah, I think it is definitely down to framing your terms appropriately and figuring out why we're framing one positively and one negatively.
Jason?
Yeah, I agree 100% with Matt. The idea of the framing bias is just rampant in our communications today. When I teach biases and heuristics, we talk about framing bias, one of those. And the prime example to that is, do you want something that is 20% fat or 80% lean? And the idea is they're the exact same thing, but the way you frame something determines and drives people's behaviors in response to that, right? And I've said it before, in law school, you talk and you hear about the straw man, which is you build in your opponent this imaginary evil worst case scenario and challenge your opponent to take it down, and then you frame your side as the positive savior on the white horse that is the opposite of that. And when your opponent either refuses to engage on the straw man or can't tear it down because it's not actually reality, you say, see, I'm right and we're correct, not trying to frame the right or the left. I'm correct. And, I think that that's a problem. And we all, every one of us, because we have confirmation biases, hear those things and immediately take it and soak it up and say, yes, that's all true, because we wanted it to be true at the end of the day.
Yeah, I wrote down two things. It's funny you say that because we hear words like straw man, and here's the other one we hear, gaslighting, right?
Right. They're the same.
And yeah, well, and here's what happens though. If Eric presents me something that has got some facts behind it and he feels it's got some sort of good reason, I will just use words, quit gaslighting, I use these words that we're supposed to all have some sort of an agreement on what they mean, and I just misuse them. And I just throw it out there because then Eric's going to go, ugh, that's an emotional response. That's Clint's response right there. Ugh. Eric's been in the courtroom. He doesn't do that a lot. He might, I don't know. But does that make sense? Because when you're talking and you say words like straw man, I keep thinking to myself, do you know how many times I have watched the left and the right accuse the other side of building in a straw man argument? And I'm like, but there's reality there. Quit calling it something it's not. That's disingenuous. That is not coming from a place of honesty, and you don't want agreement. You're wanting to make sure that your people vote for you. And so all that being said, Eric, how do you define compassion? How should we start that?
So that's a great question. That goes to the heart of what I think is smoking hot bullcrap about this meme. And I'm going to go ahead and be a little partisan here and start the conversation to kind of address this. It's a common argument that the left is more compassionate. How is the left more compassionate? How do they want to have people taken care of? They want to spend money on people. They want to pay for government programs. They want more and bigger government programs that are going to take care of people. Now, we can debate whether those government programs are good ideas or not, but to argue that they are more compassionate because they want to take away someone else's money from the families that have earned that money and give it to other people and those families because they feel like they're going to be helped out. The liberal says, I'm compassionate because I wanted somebody else's money taken away so they could be spent on somebody else so I can feel better. That's the right-wing response to that compassion argument, that you're not spending your own money. If you were spending your own money, that would be compassionate. Christians are taught to give to the poor, to help people who are less fortunate. Well, those things are voluntary. But if it's not voluntary, if it's forced through taxation, then that is not a compassionate thing. That's just redistribution. That's stealing from somebody to make and then liberals say, see, I feel better now because I helped somebody. No, you didn't help anybody. You took away somebody else's money and gave it away. You didn't give your own money away.
That's the other.
I'm throwing that gauntlet down now. That why that meme is so biased.
Well, that's the other meme I've seen, and this was back 4 or 5 months ago. It was, I don't see how you can be a Christian and vote Republican, and I was like, what? So that draws a line to my neighbor, right? If we both believe the same thing. Matthew or Jason, I don't care which one of you chime in, but Eric just threw the gauntlet down of what compassion is. I wrote down something I want to chime in with, but not until I hear from you two.
It's interesting because I'd love to have to be able to research more because I don't know the overall conclusion of this, but a observation that I think I have, and it's more just a personal observation, and is we're becoming a much less religious society. And Matthew could probably speak to this much more. And as we do so, we start to see things which might have been influenced by our faith stepping away from that. So contributions to nonprofits, right? So the giving of funding is going down nationally. As I look from an ethics perspective, and Eric hates it when I use this word, but the word of greed, right? I mean, the idea of, was there a time where people's faith influenced how they ran their business and how they set things up and what they did with things, how they led, how they managed. And as we get further and further away from those things, we appear to be losing those moorings, which at some point people may have self-controlled or implemented their own beliefs on themselves, self-discipline in how they acted, what they did with their money, what their company did, what they expected of their government, how they managed their life in general. and how ethical they were, how they interacted with people, and the way they saw the world, that they wouldn't lie, they wouldn't insult somebody, they wouldn't call people names, they wouldn't do the things that their faith had said. This is, watch what you say, watch what you do. And as we get further and further away from that, do we start to see a society that has lost what was maybe a silent or hidden boundaries around us? And so do we start to see one group say, yeah, we've got to start putting these boundaries on it because what was there isn't there any longer. Eric, again, doesn't like it when I talk about in the 1960s, it was 20-1 average CEO pay to the average employee pay. And today, I just saw a couple of days ago, it's now 299-1. It actually went up during the COVID piece. So is that a lack of controls where we've said we wanted to provide for everyone, and have we allowed ourselves to not be guided by what were our moral foundings there? So it's just a lot to be said of. I think there's a lot of nuance in where society is going and what we used to be able to rely upon as people keeping themselves in check and not saying things and not doing things because they were rooted in their faith. That's not there for a large group of people anymore. And when those moorings get lost, where do we end up? I don't know.
Well, and Matthew, I'll hand it off to you, but I'm okay with that 299-1 as long as I'm the CEO, if we can say that, Jason. I just want everybody to know, if anybody wants to pay me that, I'm your man. Now,
I don't care for 299. I don't care for 299-1 as long as my one is pretty decent pay for the work I'm doing. I don't give a crap what the CEO is earning if the one is decent pay based on what the work is.
Spoken like a CEO. Wait, you are a CEO. Okay. But the point being that those ones do care. And there's a hell of a lot more ones than there are CEOs. Companies, and that's the challenge that America has today. So
and the other side.
Hang on, I got to push back, Jason, because we have this conversation over and over again. They care more because people keep reminding them about the 299-1. If we reminded them to be grateful for the opportunities and the jobs that they have, the standard of living that one gets you now is pretty damn good, and it's way better than it was when it was 20-1. So it's part of the framing of these narratives to create this division.
Well, and I also say this: without the CEOs, and I won't even say the CEOs, but without the business owners, then the ones are kind of they better go find other business owners to go work for, because the business owners taking all the risk. I'm not saying it's right or wrong. I'm just saying that's part of the narrative that gets overlooked too. Is there are risks involved in this?
And I would say that if it had been 299-1 in the 60s and it's 299-1 today, then that's society as moving along correctly. But when you look over the last 50 years, we've gone from 20 to 60 to 90 to 150 to 299. That's where you start to say that there may be something that we need to look deeper into.
And I think that's true on almost everything. Government programs, where the spending is percentage, where it was in the 60s to now. I mean, I think we could probably pull that apart in a bunch of topics. The thing I will say about Eric, and then Matthew.
Are you going to let Matthew talk now?
If you let me do my job, that's where I was going, Eric. Do you want to host it? I can jump off, homeboy. So what I was going to say, Matthew, before we come to you, is one of the things that when Eric was talking about the conservatives, I want to give my money, or when Jason was talking about, we used to have these principles, maybe it was from our religion, giving back to the community. A lot of times we stop at that. We don't ask questions. Well, before I start assuming Eric doesn't want to give back, Eric, where do you give? Or Eric, what demographic would you be okay with the government helping? So figuring out more about those big sentences and those big accusations, instead of assuming we know that just makes him or her an automatic bad person, asking those questions and getting more detailed would probably alleviate a lot of this. So Jason brought up the religious point. Eric brought up the compassionate point. Matthew, it's your job for the next few minutes to dissect all that.
Sure, no problem. So yeah, those are two big topics. So on the one hand, you've got Eric bringing up sort of the ethics of taxation, which is an area that I don't have any expertise in, frankly, other than just studying philosophy. So I may try to make this a little bit more simplistic in my response. So it helps me sometimes to think about that topic in terms of being a parent. How best do I want to support my child, right? So this is who you're wanting to support in this case is someone who is as important to you as could possibly be, right? So you want to get it right. And there's sort of these two diametrically opposed poles that you have as a parent, which is compassion, help them out, support them, give them everything you can so that they have what they need in order to succeed, but also demanding that they take upon themselves struggle so that they can themselves develop their own capacities to become better on their own, because what you ultimately want is for them to no longer be depending upon your compassion. So getting that balance right is, frankly, probably one of the biggest fights that a lot of parents have. Traditionally, stereotypically, it's the father who's going to be pushing for more responsibility, and it's the mom who's going to be pushing for more compassion. My wife and I play musical chairs when it comes to that. It just depends on what the issue is. But yeah, I think I don't know that I'm quite willing to go quite so far down the road of saying that all taxation for the purposes of supporting people who need some support is unethical. But I can also see Eric's point that you can go too far down that road. And the way that you can do that is when the money that you are giving or the support that you're giving stunts the growth and the development of the people that you're trying to help, when it actually makes them when it slows that down, when it makes them dependent ultimately and perpetually on your compassion, are you really helping? Right? I wouldn't want that for my own son. I certainly don't want that for anybody else. So how do you get that balance right? And I don't have that answer. One. So that was the first point. That was Eric's point about the ethics of taxation. You guys can do with that what you will. Sorry if that's a vague response. To Jason's point about religion. So I'm going to be responding from the perspective of a non-believer myself, who spent much of my 20s hastily throwing out the baby with the bathwater when it comes to religion. And in my 30s realizing, there might be something there that we're losing, right? So as we become more secular and as religious morality becomes less of that sort of invisible drive that Jason, you were mentioning, where it's just kind of the substrate, the foundation that we're all kind of mutually drawing upon. I do worry. I really do, because we talk about needing to be moral and needing to be generous and take care of each other in a way that I think Christians have been talking about for a long time. But there's no definitive, there's no book for secular people that has, or tradition that's been established for people who aren't as religious to draw upon, that says, these are the good things, these are the things that you need to do in order to be virtuous, in order to be a good person, in order to be a good citizen. Not at the same level of the Bible, certainly, or of the tradition that Christianity has. I would point to Madison and John Stuart Mill and kind of some of their work on what it is to be a citizen within a liberal society. But frankly, I don't think nearly as many more secular people actually read that stuff and are familiar with it and can apply it. For most of us, my general sense is they're just ready to throw out that bathwater, and the baby is what it is.
Well, that goes to a lot of what we see in today's world, right, Jason or Eric? I mean, we see so many people, and again, Eric, you sent me something to remind us. We see so many people wanting to cut the fences and cut these ties that have kept us tied to the dock, and not understand that once you cut those ties, you're going to wonder if you don't have some direction. And I just see people now coming on cutting things, going, we just don't need religion. Let's leave our mom and dad's religion. We don't need this. Let's leave it. And again, I'm not saying it doesn't deserve some sort of conversation, But when we do that, I think it's easy at that point to start having these definitions that are in silos, right? I will define what compassion is, and I will attribute that you are not compassionate based off me. There's no agreed upon definitions as a society. None. So how do we then operate together? How does Clint and Jason get along if we don't even know what those words mean anymore?
Who are you throwing it to?
Jason, or I can throw it to you, Eric.
Eric hadn't talked in a while. That's where I thought we were going. Yeah.
So one thing I'd like to circle back around to is Jason, I think accurately, and probably you knew this, Jason, that the founding fathers, and I think it was Madison included in the Federalist Papers, said something along the lines of that a free people cannot govern themselves without some sort of religious foundation. And essentially that was one way to provide a common moral foundation of a shared value that would allow a country, a people, a republic to have a way to have a moral compass, to not just go in different directions. And whether it is establishes Christian moral values or Judeo-Christian moral values or historical values based on those, having some external source of values, I think, is a key element in a free society, having a way for people to find a way to agree on what is moral and what is not. And having a secular society, or more and more secular society, is contributing to the polarization that's going on today. And it's hard for us anymore to talk as liberals and conservatives about what do we really want government to do and what should we do. When that's the essential question, isn't it? That's really what we're debating, is what's the appropriate role of government? Is it to provide redistribution, to provide for compassion? Is it just to be a neutral referee? And where's the compromise between those two? But if we don't have a way to talk about that is a common shared set of values, because we're not all generally religious anymore, as Jason brought up, then what are the common values? And then when you get people who want to come in and say, well, the common values include my lived experience and my own truth, now we're way off of any chance to have any kind of reasonable conversation. But I think most people in the middle are willing to still have that conversation. So going back to the original meme that you started talking about, which is basically somebody on the left saying conservatives are not compassionate, and that's why they're always going to be on the left. It goes back to the idea of what you said. What is compassion? And does compassion mean using the government to take care of the problem so you don't have to worry about it? That's a common response from a person on the right to say liberals are not compassionate. They're just shifting the work to somebody else, but they're taking away somebody else's money to do it. And then Matthew brought up the good point that once you start doing that as a system, you create the dependency of people who are being taken care of by the government, and that's not how they're going to ever mature. And another criticism of those kind of programs is they don't necessarily work, or they're highly inefficient. And we've talked about this in our previous talks, that the larger the problem that is trying to be solved, that is within a larger complex system, then the more unintended consequences you're going to have when you try to fix that problem. And the more expensive it's going to be, and whether you can solve the problem at all is kind of doubtful in the long run. So that's another reason why conservatives say, hey, big government programs don't necessarily work. It doesn't mean we're not compassionate. It just means let's see if we can find the smartest way with the least dollars to solve the problems that we can focus on, which goes back to just one of those other simple memes. It used to be, or at least it still kind of is, the meme is conservatives are mean and liberals are stupid. Now, how do we talk to each other?
I don't know. Let's say hi to Rob, who chimed in. We need to seek via media, but hold to personal morals.
Yeah, so via media is the middle way. And it's the way the Episcopal Church calls itself, the via media. It's the middle way is what I think he's saying, is that we need to find the middle way, but yet still hold to our personal morals. And that is, we all come to the table with our bias. My bias is the peacemaker, centrist, compromise. When we live in a society that is 50-50, and in some aspects our society is 50-50 today, then we should strive to govern in moderation, and we should strive to compromise, and we should strive to find ways of doing things. throw out, okay, so the left says we need to provide college education for everyone. Okay, well, the right comes up with a way that instead of taxing and the government paying for it, that they encourage businesses to create scholarships that can help pay for people to go to schools, and it becomes tax deductible for businesses. And I'm making all this up, but the idea is that we find what are we trying to accomplish, and then what's the best way to accomplish it, and we all agree and we move forward on that. I wish we lived in a society where, our city council here locally is nonpartisan in the context, meaning you don't run as a Republican or a Democrat. You run for the betterment of the city. Now, everyone running is either a Republican or a Democrat or an independent. They fall within one of those categories, and they're rooted in that foundation. But I was at a recent city council meeting. Every single vote was 5-0. Every single one. Because by the time it got to and I know not everyone on the council has the exact same opinions, but by the time it got to the vote for the council, they had rooted out and figured out what direction they were going to go so that every vote could be 5-0. Now, they didn't try to argue it, and they didn't have to try to fight it out to say, oh, I'm going to take a stand because I'm going to make an election and I want 100% of what I want and you get 0% of what you want. We negotiated out till everybody could say, okay, I'm comfortable with that. Because if they did nothing, we wouldn't have all the new things that the city is approving and that they're trying to do and to advance the city. And I think that I at least remember there being a day, and maybe I'm just rewriting history. I do live in another world of Pollyanna. I see the world through rose-colored glasses. I'm remembering a day where we used to value the ability to compromise. We looked to people who they said, yes, they can reach across the aisle. Yes, they can help forge a compromise and move things forward. And we used to say, that's who I want as my leader, because they will find a way forward for the betterment of the nation. It's why Washington in his farewell address said the risk of factions, and that you would no longer do what was best interest of the country. You would do what is in the best interest of your faction, which he was implying the party. And you would have to hold to the party's line as opposed to doing what was in the best interest of the country. And today we villainize the moderates, right? The right absolutely loves Joe Manchin, right? Oh, he's the best Democrat out there. Why? Because he's keeping the left from doing the radical things, right? The left is not so happy with Joe Manchin because he's not, and the left loves Mitt Romney and Susan Collins and Lisa Murkowski. The right hates them and despises them. Why? Because they're trying to forge that middle ground. And we no longer are tied to this idea that we should focus our country on small steps in one direction or another, but that everything should be done in balance and seeking to turn the Titanic to a certain degree, and that we should have votes that are 65-35 or 70-30 on everything, as opposed to we can't compromise because that would give this person a bipartisan bill and then they can say they're bipartisan and they might win the next election. We're so tied to 100% of what I want or nothing. In both sides, to a certain extent, extremes are to that extent. And I think that to me, if there's one solution that we could make, is if we change the mindset of everyone, that the leader we should vote for, the person you vote for should be the one that is most likely to compromise, we'd be a totally different nation.
Matthew, you got some feedback on that? I've got a couple things written down, but I want to make sure I've got something I'm going to ask you specifically in just a minute.
Yeah, and I can just point to maybe an example, a recent example of where there was a movement to do, I think, what, Jason, you're actually describing here, which is I don't know if you guys are familiar with the Unity 2020 campaign.
Yeah.
The idea was let's get two patriotic Americans, one on the left and one on the right, and they will run as for vice president and president. But they will only be able to make decisions in that role if they get elected, if they both agree. And once they've reached the end of their 4-year term, if they get reelected, they switch. So the other person becomes president, and the president becomes vice president, right? And they were looking specifically for people just like what you're describing, which is people who are on the left or the right, but who are and who are recognized for being capable and patriotic, but willing to talk and to compromise. I'm hoping that we'll see more of that.
Hey, Clint, before you follow up, because I know you're going to have a good question for Matthew, but I just want to follow up a specific question. Matthew, that Unity, I hadn't heard about Unity 2020, but when you describe that system, does that remind you another government system that's almost identical? Jason? Does that remind you of another government system that's almost identical? What's that copying?
Congress.
The Roman Republic.
I don't even recall, yeah.
The Roman Republic, before the fall of the Republic and became an empire, a lot of power was in the Senate, but the executive power was 2 co-consuls. That they had to agree for an executive action to take place. That lasted for about 350 years in the Roman Republic. Julius Caesar overthrew the system that you're describing, Matthew. That's exactly what the Roman Republic had in place for centuries. And it worked great as a republic until they got so big and so fat and so powerful, and Julius Caesar pulled off what he did. But that's part of the classic history that our founding fathers had studied, that you had to have 2 co-counsels to do the executive actions. It could, but stuff could happen a lot faster than having to have it pass through the Senate when you needed to take action. But you had to have 2 different guys.
And I think if you look at the Constitution, and Eric, you correct me if you disagree, and I know you will. You will correct me, not that you'll disagree. Our Constitution was built on, not only was it framed on a compromise, but it was built to force compromise, right? The Senate and the House and the executive, and then the oversight of the Supreme Court is all intended to force compromise. And our founding fathers saw that as the solution to the whims of a public, and as a way to prevent authoritarianism and to force us to seek the common good. And the common good would come out if the House, the Senate, the President, and the Supreme Court all said yes, right? And what we're seeing today, I think, is this idea of, if we don't compromise, nothing happens. And when nothing happens, that's when you start to get this idea of struggle and change, and the idea of secession and whatnot, because we're so tied to this idea that I want everything my way, and if I can't get it my way, I'm going to take my ball and go home. And that's not what our Constitution was built on. So if you're saying, yes, I love the Constitution, I'm 100% of the Constitution, you should equally be saying, and we all need to be compromising, because that's what the Constitution was intended to drive us towards.
Well, and 2, though, if you've got these parameters built in, you also have to understand that doesn't mean you'll get what you want all the time. What I see now is people wanting to get in charge and then change the rules so they keep winning down the road. In other words, we don't accept that there's supposed to be some conflict and some rub on these ideas, and some stuff doesn't get through, some stuff does, like you're talking about, Jason. We just see it as, well, if I'm not winning all the time, then when I do get power, when I say, the party that I'm in gets power, we'll just change the rules. We'll do this, we'll do that, we'll do the other thing, because winning, it's about winning now, not compromise. I think compromise is great, but it's got to be compared to a principle. I mean, if we're compromising, what are we compromising in regards to? In other words, these agreed upon terms we all seem to go back to. Let's make a compromise, but it's almost like there's a ratchet only going one way. It's these small incremental compromises. It's taking us away from stuff. And if you say you want to stay tied to something from the past, you are vilified, it seems like. Again, that's just me maybe looking at too many memes, and I need to go have a life, but it's just me and my dog. So I think I see it from a conservative and Richard Roberts chimed in here. He said, hasn't compromise created what we have today? The right always seems to be compromising in little increments, like the left is always the squeaky wheel. In other words, we have to compromise. So this is where we start. This is where we're at. We're going to go a little bit more. And then every time we talk about what this core principle is, we are called names or told to be quiet, or society's different. There's no conversation. It's more accusations. The other thing I'm going to throw in, Matthew, I was going to ask you earlier, I'd love to address at some point in time. I think politics and government is the new church and religion. I think people are looking to government for answers. Eric, if you want to talk about this, what the government can and can't do as far as big problems, government, I think people are abandoning the church a lot of times and looking to government for those soul issues, and the government will never be able to be your church. But I think people are looking to government now to the church. That's why you have the fanaticism behind it.
That is certainly one of the big criticisms about what is going on the far left, that has become a secular religion to be woke and to believe certain things or else. Matthew, it's your turn. I'll quit interrupting.
Yeah, John McWhorter is actually going to be releasing a book here within the next few months, I want to say, on that specific thesis. He's a linguist out of, I want to say, Columbia University. And I'll admit I'm pretty sensitive and partial to that argument. I think there's a lot there. And I am very worried, to your point, Clint, and Eric, that political identity has come to utterly usurp religious identity on the far left, because I think there was a void in many respects. And people need meaning. And it's something that I don't think I fully appreciated in my 20s. Being the typical hedonistic 20-something, people need some sense of direction. I think almost everybody needs something like that. And with the increasing secularization, it is something that I think a lot of people are looking for elsewhere, and they've found it in politics. They've found it in trying to make the world a better place through the specific lens that they're operating from. And that's one reason why, because it's taken on sort of this religious quality to it, in many respects, that makes it harder to have those difficult conversations with people, because now it's no longer just, we're trying to work together to figure out the best path forward. It's, you're questioning my identity, my source of meaning. That's a big deal.
Well, think of this, Jason, and now I'm listening to what you said, Matthew, and I hear what Jason said. If you use the Bible, okay, I grew up a Christian. I still am a Christian. I read the Bible as much as I possibly can. Could probably do better at it. But what the Bible does is helps me define what compassion means for me. In other words, me to give back to my neighbor, me to take care of my neighbor. If government's the new religion, they get to define compassion. And so now, when the government defines compassion, it's we collectively give back to our neighbors, which means we collectively have to take from you more, or we have to do things, and we define it as the big I and not the little I, if that makes sense. So the Bible or religion identifies usually compassion towards the individual. You have to define that as a person per Jason. But if government is the new religion, then it gets to define it for us four, because we're all part of that spirit, that one. Does that make sense?
Yeah, two quick things. One, just real quick response to that. And I agree with you. I think that what you said is actually true. But I think that there's an observation that the right's been doing that for years as well. Why were we against gay marriage? Because it was against our religion, and the government shouldn't sanctify that. Why were we against abortion? Because it's our religion, and the government shouldn't sanctify that. So, and I'm not arguing the rightness or wrongness of either of those issues. I'm saying that I don't think the left owns this concept of utilizing the government to implement our ideas or what might be our religious thoughts there. And in a quick response to Richard Roberts and some of the ideas that came out of there, I think that what he says is true to the context of the right always seems to be the one that's compromising, the left always seems to be the leaky wheel. And that's why we call them what we call them, conservatives, which is, I don't want to do anything. I don't want to change at all. And progressive, I want to push to something different. And if you go back to 1776 or 1789, when the Constitution was implemented, the only people that could vote were landed gentry males, right? So at some point when they said, we need to take away this land requirement and ownership requirement to allow people to vote, there were conservatives who said, that's a bad idea. We're going to ruin the country. This is horrible. That's not what our founders put into place. And then some other people said, no, we need to do that. And then 150 years later, when they said we need to give women the right to vote, there were people that said, that's a bad idea. We're going to ruin the country. This is horrible. Those damn progressives are changing the country, changing the idea of what we are. So, I mean, he's right in the context, but I think the back to as someone talked about the water that you're swimming in, the water conservatives are swimming in today is the world that they were granted. And the idea of resistance to change or pushback or even to compromise there is based off the world they knew. It's not the world that it was forever. Every iteration has had some form of compromise or some form of change to get where we are today. And that's not right nor wrong. It's just that the struggle that we're intensely dealing with is the same struggle that was dealt with at different epochs in our nation's history to get us to the place we are today. And a progressive will look at it and say, the only reason women have the right to vote is because the progressive pushed the conservatives to allow that to happen. The only reasons blacks have the right to vote is because a progressive pushed a conservative to force to change to allow that to happen. So it's not an argument of rightness or wrongness. It's an argument of conservatives need to look at the history and say, there was a conservative that was arguing against change about something which today we would look at and say, why would we even have that idea? Why? I can't imagine that we wouldn't have allowed this to happen, because that's the water we're swimming in. 50 years from now, there'll be a conservative who looks back to what's happening in this moment and say, oh my gosh, I can't believe that somebody was pushing against some concept or not. Now, not every issue, but some certain issues are only where we are today because there was some force of progressiveness to get there. Now, I will tell you that the conservatives, quite frankly, my opinion, is what's held our nation together, because I firmly believe that change has to happen slowly, and that it's the conservatives that slow the change to get to the place that allows the nation to get comfortable to say, okay, we're all there now. We're all okay with this happening now. And without the governor on the amount of change, we'd lead to violent disruptions on both sides of it. And that's the challenge that we have today, is how do we keep, the lid on the pot before it just blows? But the conservatives have to recognize that that without progressives being the squeaky wheel over the last 250 years, we'd still be sitting in a situation where blacks were slaves and women couldn't vote, and the only people that could vote were people that owned their home. And it wasn't just their home. I believe it was a certain amount of land you had to own before you were able to even vote. And so change did happen for the good because we were pushing it. Conservatives are good because they kept us from the big revolt of the massive change. But the arc of history will be of change.
So, Jason, interesting point you just made. It exactly echoes a conversation that you and I have a good friend, John Hilbert. He and I sitting outside the Love Shack in the summer right before we started our third year of law school, and we had this identical conversation at one of those law school parties, and he made exactly the point that you were making. And my counter argument to him was that, yeah, there's a lot of stuff that's good for progress, but not everything has been progress in the right direction.
Sure.
So I think conservatives may still have a role, or maybe it's libertarians that still have a role, that at some point you can expand the size of government too much and it needs to be contracted. That progress may be in a different direction, and some of it may be returning to a smaller role of government in our lives.
Sure.
Maybe it's less spending on social programs. That you can only afford so much if we're going to pay for free medicine, free education, and free everything, and you end up with communism, and that's never worked. And that's one of the problems with the old-fashioned argument between left and right, liberals and conservatives, is the conservative point of view. If you take the conservative economic extreme, what will happen? We will have some people left behind, but we will arguably have a better standard of living for more people. If we follow the left to their extreme, we will have so much progress that everybody's going to be equally poor, except a few rich elites who have houses in freaking Siberia and nice places in Cuba. Do you really want to live in Cuba, Venezuela, or the Soviet Union before the fall of communism? And that's the ultimate logical conclusion of progressivism. And so slowing it down is not enough. Slowing it down at times can be a good thing if what the ultimate compromise is something that's better for society. But there are things that are worse as well. And that's part of the debate we should be having, instead of arguing over memes, which goes back to I think something we should cover in an upcoming podcast is the power of social media and how it's gone from 30 minutes of news per night to sound bites that were 3 sentences long to now, if you can't fit it in a meme, it doesn't work, which started this conversation.
Well,
okay, go ahead. I'm just going to share this last thing, that I think it is important for us as a society now to kind of understand that we need to be able to have these conversations. And one of the things that very much concerns me about social media and our society's direction is there's a tendency towards censorship, that if your idea doesn't agree, if you don't have the right idea, we can shut you down. And it worries me. One of the big things that I kind of agree with the criticism about Donald Trump was his attack on the media. I think he went overboard. But now Joe Biden Jen Psaki announced the other day that they're working with Facebook to shut down unreliable information. Well, it's unreliable as deemed by their side politically. And I have a real concern. What we need to be able to do is have these conversations and have a national debate of a lot of issues, instead of telling each other, if you don't agree with me, you're bad and evil, and oh, by the way, you should be banned.
Eric, I'm going to throw your quote up here in a minute, let you talk about that, because we do have a little time left. And one of the things that, Jason, you had mentioned, if it's okay if I go back in the conversation a little bit, and well, you were talking about the gay marriage and abortion, and for years the right has kind of done the same thing. 100% agree. And I think that's why the system we've put in place is so genius, is because it does allow, like you said, it moves slow, but it does allow us to navigate that with yes, no, and we're moving forward on the right things. You temper that with what Eric said. Not everything we've done has been progressive. It's been moving, but maybe not in the right direction. But my pushback on it a little bit is, when I was saying that government's almost become like religion, is it used to be people believed in insert religion here. I'll use the Bible because that's my religious belief, but I think it could be said for any religion. So we believe this, and so it forms our opinions on how we vote and what we think we should do as a society. And some religions are more prone to try to convert and want to witness to you and say that's fine. But government now, if you're looking at government as the religion, that's where we're looking for the answers to the place where we also are supposed to give our opinions, and we're trying to convert people. So now, if you don't say what we want you to say, if you don't hold up the right sign, if you don't have the right mantra, the very thing that has now become our church and our Bible, ask us to believe it, we have to give it back. In other words, I'm being real clumsy, so let me try to do better. So the Bible is separate from religion. So I get my meaning from here and I give my opinions here. If government's my religion, I get my opinions from here, I say it back to them, and I vote for them. It's a one-way thing. There's nothing outside my religion to give me anything, pushback, or force me to question my religion, if that makes sense. One of the things that I think has helped Christians, if we would embrace it, is as society changes, it should force us to either understand why we believe what we believe better, or to have to change our opinions about some stuff. But if my religion is government and I'm looking to government, they are giving me my definitions, they are giving me my principles, and I'm just regurgitating it back to them. There is no outside influence, which seems like we're trying to cut off those. Did anything what I just say make sense at all? For the love of God, somebody help me out, please. Jason, since you said that, does that make sense to you at all?
No, it does make sense. And I think the lines are blurred on both sides. And I think that's the challenge, is how do we, how do we get to a place where we start to recognize that our faith should influence our vote? I mean, I don't think that it shouldn't. I think our faith should influence our vote. But how do we manage that from a government perspective? And just real quick response to one thing Eric said, if that's okay.
Yeah.
He talked about restraining speech, basically, and restraining of ideas and stuff. And I think that's a concern that we need to have. But I'd push back also to say that what often we hear from the right about the left is it's the cancel culture. It is the kind of catchphrase now, right? And it's the idea of, if I say something that is counter to what you believe, then I'm canceled to that extent. And I guess the question I would raise is, what is a greater concern to society today? Is it that people listen to what someone else says and they respond, or is it the government eliminating things that you can say and the government telling you what you can and you can't say. Which would be your biggest fear?
Are you asking me? The answer obviously is the government doing it, but the fear of what's actually going on today is that the government is working hand in hand with big tech, and it's no longer a neutral platform, that the tech industry and the government are basically tending toward fascism as it's technically defined, which is the government and industry working together, and the government and ultimately having power and control.
So
And that's the big fear. That's
my
okay. Go ahead,
follow-up would be that then you would disagree with all of the critical race theory laws or the laws that are being passed today, which says you can or can't teach ideas. These are ideas you can't teach. These are things you can't say. These are things you can't do in the school. Then.
So you just opened up a big can of worms. I think it's worth a whole separate discussion, because Barry Weiss, in the podcast I shared with you guys the other day, just spent an hour and a half with David French and another guy, and I forget the other guy's name. Yeah. Say it again, because I was speaking over you.
Christopher Rufo.
Yeah, Christopher Rufo. Christopher Rufo was on the side of it's okay for government to pass laws to ban this stuff because it's so bad. But really, he broke it down to government can pass those laws to prohibit certain things from being taught in public schools as the opinion of the state. That's clearly not okay. Banning the discussing those topics in colleges or allowing those to be talked about generally, of course, is protected speech. And where do you divide those lines? And it was a great hour and a half long conversation. And by the way, for anybody who's listening to this that hasn't found it yet, Barry Weiss has a great podcast, and I'm brain farting the name of it right now. I'll remember it in a minute. But it is Barry Weiss used to work for the New York Times. She is a liberal, probably not progressive, but solidly liberal, who left the New York Times because she didn't feel like she had the ability to be a journalist anymore, because they had gone so far down the rabbit hole that if you didn't agree with certain things on I'd argue she would call it the woke agenda, then you weren't allowed to say those things. And that's the kind of pressure she has. So she has started her own podcast. B-A-R-I is her first name, Barry Weiss. I highly recommend it. And that was a recent discussion, Jason, was exactly that idea. And so the short answer is, can the state of Tennessee, for example, or Oklahoma or whatever, ban the teaching of certain things in high schools? Yeah, I think that's probably constitutional, and they can do that. Because the way it's taught is this is the right, it's not being taught as an idea either. It's being taught as this is the truth. And that's a problem. And if it's being taught by the state, then that's a problem. On the other hand, Oklahoma or Tennessee can't pass a law that says you can't have a website that discusses critical race theory. But what's happening is similar issues that are just as debatable are being put up on Facebook. And then the United States President's Office works with Facebook to say, you have to take that information down that we've deemed to be unreliable. That's scary as hell. That's right out of Goebbels. That's the government working with private industry to censor thought.
But even if they say you don't have to take it down, even if it's not direct like that, it's the wink, wink, nod, nod. Hey, you have a nice restaurant here. I'd hate for it to burn down later. You know, the Godfather technique of, hey, no, we don't want you to. But
I'm not taking down your post, but I'd hate for it to be algorithmed away so no one sees it except
or I would
your mom.
hate for us to have more congressional hearings about more restrictions we could put on social media if you don't do what we want. And that's dangerous no matter who's in charge. And I think we've got 3 good conversations coming up. First of all, I'm a big believer that not all ideas are equal. I think society ends up saying that some ideas are just ideas we're going to put on the table, and some ideas we're going to put in the closet and just not talk about it anymore. I think that's completely acceptable when you're trying to keep a society together, especially of 300-something million people of all different cultures. Critical rate.
Hey, Clint, real quick. Barry Weiss's podcast is called Honestly. Highly recommend it.
Well, we're going to go over your quote. CRT, though, religion and politics, and social media and the government, I think are 3 great conversations for future podcasts. But I will say this, and Jason, you said it, and I think I can't wait till we have this bigger conversation, because if faith will influence my vote and my faith is in the government, then that is an issue, because then the very thing I'm voting for and giving power to is telling me how to vote and give power, who to give power to. And most of the time, human beings, when they get in a position of power, not all people, but once the system's in place, it becomes about keeping the power and not necessarily doing what's best for people who aren't in my group, if that makes sense. So I believe that we are heading down the religious realm of politics and government. Eric, we got a few more minutes left. Normally these things go an hour, a little over. I'm going to post, do you want me to post that quote and you read it to us?
Yeah, I think it's a good one. Let's talk about that. Part of the concern that conservatives have about liberals is that it's not just economics. The liberals more and more want to control everything. And this is a long quote that's often cited just in bits and pieces. So this is from C.S. Lewis, from one of his collections of defenses of theology.
I'm going to let you read it. I'll be right back.
Okay. Of all tyrannies, a tyranny sincerely exercised for the good of its victim may be the most oppressive. It would be better to live under robber barons than under omnipotent moral busybodies. The robber baron's cruelty may sometimes sleep, but his cupidity may at some point be satiated. But those who torment us for their own goodwill torment us without end, for they do so with the approval of their own conscience. They may be more likely to go to heaven, yet at the same time likelier to make a hell on earth. This very kindness stings with the intolerable insult. To be cured against one will and cured of states which we may not regard as a disease is to be put on a level for those who have not yet reached the age of reason, or those who have never will, to be classified with infants, imbeciles, and domestic animals. There's a lot to unpack there, but it goes along the lines of big government and some of the liberal ideas, or maybe it's the progressive ideas, essentially are being done for your own good. We need to do this to help you live better. The government needs to impose this on you for your own good, to make your life a better place. You're better off if you wear a seatbelt. You're better off if you don't use certain drugs and alcohol. You're better off if you don't smoke. And then if you just go down the list of stuff that the progressive want to impose on everybody, you need a certain level of health care, and you have to have this mandated level of health care. And at the end of the day, as long as people say, see, you need this, and I feel really good that you need this, they're imposing it because they have the belief it's for a good thing. They're the worst type of tyrants, because they don't have a limit on what they're going to try to fix. And this is a classic criticism from the right and from liberty-minded libertarians against the left.
Matthew, you're shaking your head.
And we can, again, I think it's helpful for me at least to put this in terms of, being a parent. Not everyone is, but I think the analogy works pretty well, where you don't want to go so far down this path of trying to do everything to take care of your child. At some point, they have to become less and less and less and less dependent upon you. And if what you're doing is not directly oriented towards that, then you're going to keep your child a child forever. They are going to be infantilized. They're going to become, in Lewis's words, an infant, an imbecile, or a domestic animal. Right? No one wants their kid to be that way when they grow up, that I know of at least. If you do, you're probably a bad parent, frankly. So I think there is a place for the conversation as far as, does this help people get to the point where they're no longer needing to depend upon on our support? And if so, then it's probably a good program. But if not, we need to reorient, right? Maybe we need to progress away from what the progressives wanted. You can, and good examples, look at welfare, look at affirmative action, right? Did they get us where we needed to be? Are they getting people to that point? And it remains a conversation that we need to have. And I think people on the right, Thomas Sowell is a very good example of someone who argues very persuasively that in both cases, we're actually harming the people that we're trying to help in the long term with both of those policies. And he's almost completely ignored by people on Jason's and my side, frankly. There are criticisms that you can absolutely lob at someone like Sowell or other folks who make the same argument, but they're not being made because they're being ignored. And frankly, it seems as though we're just presuming that because we're trying to help, right? Because the program is oriented towards compassion, that's all we need to really think about. We're done. Problem solved.
And that goes back to that simple meme that that conservatives are mean, but that liberals are stupid. And part of that overlaps that in less simple terms is what happens on the left sometimes is it doesn't matter whether the program actually is going to work well, whether it's going to be the efficient way to solve the problem. The point is there's a problem, and if you don't agree we need to work on that problem, you're a mean person, and we're going to find some way to just solve that problem. And so it's a legitimate criticism from the right is, but wait a minute, that program's not going to work, or it's going to make things worse, or statistically we can prove that it's been making things worse. Okay, now you're a mean person because you don't want to help people. That's where these arguments get oversimplified and just get so frustrating. Just because I'm a conservative or actually a libertarian doesn't mean I don't want to have people live better lives and be helped. I just think some of the big government programs are incredibly stupid and in fact have made things worse. They've made people more dependent. But if you say that, people on the left say, no, now you're mean.
Well, maybe they did. Maybe they were effective, and they've gone past the tipping point.
Or the long-term effectiveness has been the long-term harm caused has been worse than what help has been done.
And we know this, anyone who's been a parent, right, knows this. Sometimes you have to be mean, or at least come across in a way that seems mean to your child. Right? You can't always be super supportive and compassionate. If you're not pushing back against what your kid is doing sometimes and pushing them to struggle and to develop their own capacities, and of course you're helping them in the process, right? But that's what help needs to look like. It needs to be done in a way that allows them to develop themselves.
But I heard another good discussion the other day, and this was on a Dan Crenshaw podcast, that the way that the left treats people is not the way that you would treat somebody you love. It's the way you treat somebody you want to use. Mm-hmm. And that love would require both the compassion to help people when they really need it, but also the tough love of creating some discipline and giving them the opportunity to get better. That the ultimate goal of a welfare program should to get people to enjoy the value of a successful working life, not just to be indefinitely dependent. Those kind of arguments.
Jason, I saw your left eye twitched down. I'm good at body language.
Yeah, it was that Dan Crenshaw quote. I mean, I think that's part of the problem. The idea, I thought that was building a straw man of the idea of the left, that it's not somebody that treats somebody you'd love, it's treat somebody that you want to use. Well, I mean, I think I think every conservative would go, yes. And the liberals would be like, really, I created this program because I want to use these people? I just think that's not advancing the conversation of how we really talk about what we're trying to do. So that was my initial reaction was, I hate quoting right or left when I think that they're just poking at the other side and trying to build the other side as an idea that there's something wrong with that. I think,
but it goes like the oversimplification at the beginning with the original meme was that the left is about compassion, and we've kind of broken that down. So it's the same thing, Jason. I don't think he literally means that the left just wants to use people, but the idea is that these programs are not designed to truly be compassionate. They're not really designed to help people get better, to get to a better place. It's the thing that Matthew and I were just saying. On the left, as long as the program is intended to help people, you've done the right thing. But wait a minute, this program is making more people dependent on the government. It's making fewer people work. It's making them mentally less healthy. And so that's the real discussion, not whether Dan Crenshaw oversimplified it in his little quote. The question is, why is it that people on the left can't see that some programs don't work, that you have to evaluate the quality of the government program and use a cost-benefit analysis, look at the other unintended consequences, and actually analyze all that? And the left basically says, you can't do any of that because now you're a mean person. if you ask those questions.
I hate to say this. I've been writing this down. Listen, I agree with Dan Crenshaw 100%. And I'll tell you why right now. And I very rarely give this kind of pushback. I think if we don't see that there's people on the right, we've all agreed in these conversations, there's extremes on both sides. Those extremes are the ones that get all the headlines. They're the ones that cause they create the damn memes that everybody shares that I'm an idiot enough to share and talk about, right? If we don't think that they have hijacked good people for nefarious means, I think we are being our heads in the sand. I do think there are people on the left that dependence equals votes. I do think there's people extreme on the right that say if I hold up my Bible enough, whether I live by it or not, that I will get the votes from people that won't evaluate my personal life. I will use them. We have mules for a reason, right? They've made movies about it. There are people who see power in hijacking the ordinary. There are people who hijack the terms and the commonality that we share, and they ride that damn thing until they get the power, and then they put plans in place to feed the machine, going back to the faith-based analogy, right? Look to me for the definitions. I give you the definitions. You vote for the things that are going to benefit you. Why would you vote me out? And so I believe that Dan Crenshaw is 100% right, except the only difference is I think there's true on the right and it's true on the left. But if we act like everybody's acting in good faith, then I think we're in danger of what me and Eric have said when we were doing our book review, to ignore the fact there are people out there who truly are in this for 100% for the power. That's it.
And I would agree 100% with you. Had Dan Crenshaw said, and some on the left, are you doing this to use?
Maybe he did. Maybe he did. I don't have the exact quote. Yeah. So
I just like the fact that you agree with me more than Dan Crenshaw, because he's really famous. So thank you, sir. Appreciate that.
And I think that the reality is that we live in a society where we attack the other side, and we put the other side in a position, in a box that is negative to them. And the other reality is that we tend to try to not even admit things. Eric brought up healthcare and stuff, and the government telling you what to do with healthcare. Well, yeah, you're right. Should the government tell you how much healthcare you should have or not? Maybe, maybe not. But the other side of that is the money is getting spent on healthcare no matter what. The money is there. It's getting spent. You're just paying more for all the uninsured because they show up at the hospitals and doctors and it's there. So you're being charged and billed more because of that anyway. So I mean, we sometimes lose sight of the realities because of our political blindness to what defining what a future should be, because we're trying to hold on to a past that wasn't really the past.
There's so much pushback on that. I agree with a lot of it. I will say this: when we say things like other side, I'm trying my best to realize that other side means my family, my neighbors, my classmates, my new friend Jason, and my old friend Eric, and my new friend Matthew. You guys may be the other side of this. And if I don't personalize it, it's easy for me to start calling you something that will make me and you enemies down the road. Mm-hmm. I believe when you say, if you're posting memes out there, and I'm not telling you I haven't done it. So if you want to go look at my page and bring them up, that's fine. And I'm not telling you they don't make good points. But as soon as you say, I vote this way because I'm compassionate, and you vote that way because you're selfish, that's kind of an asshole move, because that's not true to anybody. Richard Roberts said this, and I always like to try to include people that participate. Public schools have dumbed down people to accept memes. Richard, I feel a little triggered by this, sir. I feel a little triggered. He used to tune in with me and Monica Perez all the time. They can't have long, meaningful conversations, or maybe to where people just can't listen. And I agree with that. I think the art of conversation is becoming a lost art. Richard said, LOL. Yeah. I'll thank you to mind your own affairs, sir. I'll be triggered by any damn meme I want to, by gosh.
So can I push back with Jason a little bit, just to ask this question? So Jason, maybe the way that I quoted Dan Crenshaw was maybe a little bit too I don't think he said all people on the left, but he said generally programs on the left are not instituted in the way that you would do if you love somebody and wanted them to get better. They're done in a way that you're going to ultimately be able to control those people. Now, having said that, let's leave that aside for a second. And the real issue, this argument is the classic one. Conservatives are mean, liberals are stupid. All kind of encapsulates this important question, which is this. What's the important thing to look at when you're looking at a government program? Is it the intent of the program, or is it the actual effectiveness of the program? And if you try to criticize the effectiveness of the program, what you hear from the left is not an analysis of whether the program's effective or not, but the fact that you're questioning it makes you a mean person. That's the hard part about these conversations, is that I think we would agree, people in the middle would mostly agree, we need to look and see whether a program is effective or not, and what's the best cost benefit analysis. But I don't always see that being the conversation taking place, obviously.
Yeah, I think that that's exactly right. I mean, and I don't know that you present it as a binary choice either. I mean, I don't think it's either which is the one that's most important. I think that there's an idea of how do you find appropriate balance. But just like in business, you try something, and then you look back, and before you even start it, what are the measures you're going to use to determine whether this is a success or not? And then what are the milestones that you're going to go back and measure it, and how do you change course if you're not on target? I think that every government program should be held to that standard as well. So I mean, I'm not arguing against any of that. I agree with that, but I think we also need to lean training and Six Sigma and those things always talk about the 5 whys. And I think that you have to also peel back to get to what's the root cause, and how do you start to design a program to drive the root cause difference. And I think that's where sometimes we start first why. Well, what did this happen? Well, because of this. Why did this happen? Because of this. Okay, well, why did that happen? Because of this. Well, why did that happen? Because of this. Well, why did that happen? Because of this. And why did that happen? Because of this. That's what you need to fix. And if you fix that, it's going to trickle all the way to fixing of these things. And whether it's race, whether it's poverty, whether it's whatever the issue is, if we peel back to the 5th why, I think we'll start to get to a place where we all start to go, okay, let's try to address that issue then. Now, can the government do that or not? I don't know.
And how do we as a society do that if you only have 164 characters or whatever it is, or you have a meme that's 2 sentences long? Otherwise, the kids today won't pay attention.
Matthew, you've been shaking your head a lot. Before we wrap this thing up, you need feedback on stuff that's been said, because I want to make sure.
Yeah, I mean, because I come from more of a sort of social science background in philosophy, I also want to just point out that sometimes the answer to that 5th why is 10 different things that interact with each other. And so you've got to be able to pinpoint as best you can which of those things is the biggest contributing factor. Can we do anything about that? And if so, what's the best thing to do about that going forward? And in many respects, that means we have to very precisely understand what success looks like what's our end goal here. That will then force us to ask questions like, okay, well, how will I know when I've reached it? Right? These are the measures that we're going to use. So we can't do things like, well, welfare is awesome, it's working great, because we're trying to help people, end a conversation. Well, not collecting any data on gun deaths throughout the United States, preventing the government from actively collecting this sort of thing, is a good thing. Because we don't need that information and we're done. No, we actually need to know what's going on. Number one, we need to know what our end goal is. Number two, we need to know how to measure what's going on so that we can get to where we want to go. And then once we get that data, we have to go back and say, okay, where are we? Did this fix the problem?
And if it did fix the problem, do we now need to dismantle what it took to get there and be okay with that?
Or change how it looks. Maybe don't dismantle it, but maybe it gets edited. And the last one thing I'll say this, as you're looking backwards on this from the guy who's the least educated of the 4 people on the screen, it's really hard to hold people 200, 300 years ago to the same standard of what I know now. In other words, the culture that I'm living in now, some of the stuff that people did 500 years ago in humankind would be, we would be hanging people we'd be like, what are you doing? You can't do that. most people were doing not all, most people were trying to do the best they could for them and theirs in the moments they lived in. And the times they lived in is what defined that. And I just find also it's very disingenuous to go back and judge people. Most people, evil is evil. We can see that that's why they stick out in history, and good is good, but it's really hard for me to hear people go back and judge my great grandmother or my grandfather or your grandfather. And I don't care what color people are, based off the heart and the culture we are living in now, because we're not living in their times. I think most people do the very best they can for the moments they're in. And like you said an hour ago, Jason, it's a little step forward is all any generation can really try to do to hand it off to the next generation. Massive change is really not the goal, because you want to make sure you can't control the change at that point. Eric?
I'm going to add to that. One of the other things we're going through, and the idea of conservatives slowing down the change, and why we need to talk about this going forward, goes back to the book Revolt of the Public, the tsunami of information. What we're seeing happening right now in Cuba. What did the government do? They shut down the internet, which is exactly what they did in Egypt in 2010. And different things we talked about from this book are continuing to be hot issues today. The president's office admitting that they're having regular conversations with Facebook. But just the idea, there's so much information out there. There's so many ideas going around, and the more extreme ideas get the most play. What you get likes on in Facebook and other equivalent social media platforms is the controversial stuff, which is why we sit here and we realize, having these conversations, that most people are still pretty moderate and willing to have good conversations. But there's some extremists out there, but they're not the majority. This all overlaps. And so are we going through more change today than we have in the past? I think the information technology is going to force us to deal with faster change.
To add to that,
Jason,
that would be, and I think this is something else to add to. It's the exact same conversation. Eric talked about the massive amount of misinformation. The other side of that is the massive amount of disinformation. And the recent poll that was done, I think it was by Gallup and YouGov, that 20% of America actually believes that there's a microchip in the vaccine. And that's an idea that was the disinformation component. And the corollary to that question is, and who benefits from the discord that we have as a nation, right? So Britain left the EU. Scotland's talking about leaving the UK. There's the United. There talk about secession in our country, and this idea, who benefits from that? Chinese, Russians, Iranians, who have all been implicated in disinformation campaigns with Brexit, with the Scottish independence vote, with what's going on in our country. Is there a broader manipulation that's going on that we as a country, and this discord we're feeling today, isn't even of our own creating, but is benefiting someone else who says, I can create discord in this nation. I can have them hate themselves so much that I can do what I want to do on the backside.
It's called One Wolf. Never mind. I'm not going to go down that road. It's a conspiracy. George. No, I'm not saying his name.
Does it have to do with the back of the dollar bill?
I'm not going to. There, listen, if you believe in the Bible, there's a book at the end that kind of explains everything anyway. So,
books at the end for a reason, though, because if you started there, you may not make it all the way through.
That's exactly right. And,
don't read that book backwards.
You'll start drinking after the first chapter if you start in Revelations going the other way. I can tell you that. Listen, I will throw it out there. And again, I have very little control. This is kind of one of the first times I've thrown an idea out, but I think the religion of politics is a great concept, a great topic, because I think it encapsulates a lot of the emotional stuff, and when you get into religion, science has been used inside the religious buildings forever too. You know what I'm saying? So I think that topic may open up the door, be a Pandora's box type thing, but we'll see what we talk about next week. I don't ever like leaving these conversations without giving each of you a chance to say something else, if there's anything else to say on this compassion versus selfish topic today. Eric?
I don't have anything else to say on our topic. I do want to tease one that I'd like to cover coming up soon. Going back to the power of all this information, Barry Weiss, again, another person that she has that podcast, Honestly. In addition to the one we talked about earlier, she interviewed the guy from Mumford and Sons who posted something pretty minor on Twitter and ended up having his career ended and leaving his dream job and left Mumford and Sons. And that interview is absolutely fascinating. And to me, the key takeaway is the absolute power that Twitter has over the generation a little younger than us and defines how they see the world. And if you don't say the right stuff or act the right way, it has real world consequences. And it was a real eye opener. And I think that's something worth digging into. And it goes back to this massive tsunami of information and misinformation, as Jason rightfully points out. But add on top of that, the fact that people who were raised with social media it defines their life. And that's another part of what we're going through as a change in society.
Yeah. And my kids are 17 and 22. And I'll be honest, they lean more conservative, but they're in that generation where they're thinking. And if they say anything right now to their friends that lean conservative, they are getting hammered. Social media. I'm just telling you, it's out there. It's real. Jason, Matthew, anything from either one of you guys before we wrap this thing up?
I'm good. I've said my piece.
So just to circle back to what Richard Roberts pointed out about the lack of meaningful conversation, the dumbing down of our educational system to the point of, frankly, memes in many respects, the inability to listen. This is actually somewhere where we talked about coming up with measures for, so that we know what success looks like and all these things. And I think this may be actually a very effective role for conservatives to play in the conversation, is to hold people's feet to the fire and say, look, I get it. We all want a better world for our kids. All of us. We all want to make it such that the world is changed in a way that makes it better for our kids and our grandkids. We're on board with that. But we've got to agree on what that success looks like. We've got to agree on how we're going to measure it. And we've got to agree to change course if the path that we're taking is not getting us where we've decided we need to be. And maybe we need to revise what success looks like halfway down the line. But again, we've got to agree to that. And that means hard conversations. It means genuine conversations where we really are listening to each other. And where we are dispassionately looking at the data that come from those measures that we agreed to. If we can't come to those kinds of agreements, if we can't understand what success looks like to the other side, and we can't come to some level of compromise and at least understanding, then we're going to be where we are, which is where we can't tell what's true and what's not, because we can't agree amongst any of us, frankly, about what measurements are valid and what success looks like. And we'll just be floundering.
Yeah, we'll get
Matthew, I think you're spot on. Now say all that in a 20-word meme so we can get it across.
No
well,
problem.
You can just do it now because everybody wants to succeed from the union and become their own little place now. So, hey, let's give a shout out right now to Dan Crenshaw. He can come on anytime he wants to clarify his statements. I'm all in on getting Dan Crenshaw on. All right. I think we wondered a little bit, but I think that's what these conversations are supposed to do. Take us where we need to go. And so I appreciate you guys letting me be part of it. I think it was a good conversation.
Yeah, thanks, guys, for being on. This is fantastic.
Yep.
Enjoyed it.
This is good stuff.
All right.
Likewise.
Talk to everybody later next week. See y'all.
See ya.
Take care.